Hey, it's the third week of October. You know what that means, right? The baseball season has now begun. All right, everybody, it is the third week of October. My name is J.O. I am the author of Maximize Your Medicare. The 2019 edition, go see it on Amazon.com. In addition to that, the next year's edition, 2020 and 2021 edition, is going to be published by Allworth Press. You can pre-order it now. The link is going to be here as part of this podcast. It is the annual election period right now. It started on October 15th. It concludes on December 7th. During this period, you can make unlimited, unrestricted changes to your Part D plan or your Medicare Advantage plan. It is highly advisable to double check. The reason is all the moving parts are moving around. That's not bad, meaning that the world is so competitive that Medicare Advantage continues to improve across the board. I think that is a very fair statement. However, you need to look. But to give you an idea, here are some examples. $0 PPO, that exists. It also can be the case that, for example, on the prescription drug portion, meaning the prescription drug benefits within certain Medicare Advantage plans, have become superior to Part D plans. So much so that in some instances, certain types of insulin have $0 copay. You'll have to check. It takes work. However, it's worth it. Thousands of dollars a year of benefits if that is you. Today, normally on this podcast you hear me talk about a specific topic, but I thought that what we would do today and coming up in just a couple of moments is going to be a recording of a conversation that I've had with a person, a Medicare beneficiary based out of Dallas, Texas, highly educated in healthcare, specifically qualified. In addition to that, he is the author of books. His name is Jim Goldmann. You can check him out. It's Goldmann, Jim Goldmann. The first book is called Connections, and the second one is called, there are 3 books in a series. I highly recommend you to go to Amazon or to Barnes & Noble and pick up a copy, ebook form, less than I think it's like $4 or something like that. Very, very interesting stuff. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about his experience in enrolling in Medicare, how complicated it was, even for him, someone who has the professional and educational expertise to deal with Medicare, still complicated. And then we'll talk about his very interesting books. Hope you enjoy. Well, we break from the normal practice of me just rambling on about a specific topic on Medicare, but today we have a special guest, deep in the heart of Texas, Jim Goldmann. Good morning, Jim. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
So let's go back on your background first, and then we're going to get into your very interesting books that we'll discuss here, once we're done here with our Medicare TED Talk. So you're professionally speaking, you are the very, very highly experienced.
I think that's fair. I've been in health system operations and strategy, both as a consultant and as a manager for, over 4 decades.
With some of your experience, you would have thought that Medicare would be, the easy stuff, very easily handled by you, since you interface in your work with pretty much, a lot of the different providers, et cetera, et cetera. Did you find that to be the case?
All right. Well, signing up for Part A was easy. I turned 65. I sent in the paperwork and was signed up easily. However, what I did not reckon with and did not understand was that it's much more complicated, or can be, to sign up for Part B, which is, for physician services and the like.
Let's go to the background on how you got a hold of me. So I think one of your colleagues at your workplace, is that what happened?
Yeah, one of my colleagues, a long-term colleague, in fact, suggested I reach out to you. I was a bit confused at first. What do you mean? I understand how all this works. But I thought, you know what? Rick knows what he's talking about. I'll give Jay a call.
And what did you find? So you were about to transition out of your existing employer. Is that what happened? Just for the listening people's background so that we can understand your situation.
Yeah, they moved me into an independent contractor role, which was
Gotcha.
just fine.
Right.
And they put me on or I put myself actually on COBRA, and I thought that would count for continuous coverage.
And so like you said, you were already enrolled in Part A because you already had turned 65 and full-time working covered by your employer. Is that right?
That's correct. I'm 67 now, and thought it would be an easy transition to go to Part B as well as to get supplemental coverage in Part D.
So your employer covered you while you were full-time working in your role while employed, and then when you moved to a contractor role, you then converted to COBRA. And this is very common, right? I mean, I'm sure that you'll see in your everyday walk of life on your professional experience that many, many more people are working beyond 65. And so you happen to be on COBRA. It was credible coverage while you were fully working. And when we spoke, you found something very, very different. Is that right?
Well, you advised me that, in fact, COBRA really doesn't count as continuous coverage for Medicare purposes, and that I had a limited time left to me in order to sign up for Medicare Part B without paying a premium. And I didn't, I wasn't aware of all the paperwork I had to complete in order to achieve that.
Just to add to that, it's not only what ends up happening is your health insurance, even if it were the same policy while you were fully employed, is credible, or it is qualify as health insurance, therefore allowing you to delay your enrollment in Part B. But once it turns into COBRA coverage, that does not become qualifying as health insurance for Medicare purposes. So as a result, the timer for the Part B late enrollment penalty, starts ticking. And so we had to play that and handle that situation very subtly because you are married.
Yes, I had to find coverage for my wife, who is not yet 65. And so we had to make sure that she maintained continuous coverage until about a year from now that she qualifies for Medicare.
Exactly. And so now we have this very subtle balance, right, where you don't want to have the Part B late enrollment penalty, yet you also need to find health insurance for your wife who is not yet Medicare eligible. That's a difficult dance to, partake in, and probably one that you probably wouldn't have known, just all else equal, because your normal life really wouldn't have changed otherwise.
But, well, and I understood that my wife needed different coverage, but navigating all the different options and the like is a real challenge.
So now if we, speed forward here, so you then start understanding that, the time clock so there was a gap. There's a gap from the time that you're on COBRA coverage. You can use 8 months, up to 8 months of that, and then enroll in Part B. I think we went through that, and then you tried to go to Social Security Administration to turn on Part B. And what happened?
Well, before I went, you advised me on the forms that I needed to have completed and take with me. That included a form to be signed by my former employer. And needless to say, part of me is thinking, uh-oh, how long is that going to take?
Exactly.
So I had a real sense of urgency here.
And
so at any rate,
right.
Oh, go ahead.
No, please go ahead. Keep going.
Oh, so I went into the Social Security office and I sat down with the individual, and the caseworker glanced at my materials and said, "Oh, I don't know that I can do this." And she walked away. She walked away, and she came back a couple of minutes later and said, "You're all set." And oh boy, was I relieved. And I, recognized that, being guided through, the challenges involved in this really helped tremendously, and I got the coverage at the rates I needed.
Well, the brutal thing here, right, is that you knew this fine point because we had discussed it at length, right? In other words, yes, you had COBRA. It
benefit you, your wife could stay under COBRA, but not forever, not until the time that she turns 65, which is going to be not for another year plus.
Right.
So as a result, we kind of had to walk this balance between you getting the efficient coverage for yourself, and yet also, because Texas, a very difficult individual health insurance state, something that we had talked about, we are finding this, meaning that these complications, and because of your complicated situation, even then you have filled out the form, which can take different amounts of time, depending on the employer. Then you go to the Social Security Administration, and the first response was, "Wait a minute, I can't do this." Is that what happened?
That's exactly what happened.
Oh, jeez.
Or I don't think I can do this. And I just had this, stricken look on my face. I think she took pity on me. But in any event, we were within the time frames with the documentation that was needed. So, we made her job easy, quite frankly.
And you can understand, you're the highly educated. You're the highly educated and the fully armed with the proper information down to the last detail. You can imagine, your cloned brother. What would he have done if he was not, with your background, your professional background, et cetera, and then be told by a government official? You take it as word, right? I'm not sure. I could easily see your clone brother would just shrink away and say, "We've got this problem."
Oh, and shrink away or just sit there wondering, what do I do now? And, the other element of this is that, my cloned brother might be on COBRA or whatever, have absolutely no clue without talking to an expert about what qualifies and how you qualify. It's, they don't make it clear, I should say. And as you said, I've been in this field for a long time. I understand Medicare. I've worked closely with Medicare, but didn't understand how this particular situation might impact me.
So at this time, you're in suburban Dallas, is that right?
That's correct.
Texas, difficult prior to 65, but candidly speaking, because of the population, and obviously Dallas is not, the boondocks are by any means, very highly competitive. We had configured a Medigap as well as Part D, and without naming, carriers, or what approximate price did you get at you're 67 now? And I don't have my files here for, how you got enrolled and going through that process, but approximately speaking.
You're speaking for myself or my wife?
For yourself. For
myself. My Part A is a little over, I'm trying to remember right now.
Part A is zero.
Part A is zero. Part B is about $130 a month, I believe.
Okay, right.
My supplemental, I think, is around $100 a month, and my Part D is really not terribly expensive. I think it's around $14 a month.
So you can see the math of money, Jim. Just for the people, and I already know this, but give me the ballpark for the listeners. What was your part of the COBRA coverage, approximately?
My part of the COBRA coverage was, if I recall correctly, was more than that.
More than that?
It may have been. In fact, I think it was easily twice or three times that. But you may have a better recollection than I do.
Right. In fact, I want to say, just for people to understand how dramatically superior Medicare in Jim's case, you're talking about something like, I want to say something like $900 a month each, something like that. COBRA coverage would have been.
I think that's probably fair.
So
go ahead. Sorry.
No. So you're talking 900 down to $250 a month, $650 a month running with superior coverage under Medicare is basically your end point. And
I think that's fair. I would agree that, quite frankly, the coverage, the much less expensive coverage under Medicare, the few times I've had to use it since we did this,
so
it's been so much less out of pocket. It's been great.
A lot of people get confused, and you can imagine your background, your specific background, it's easy to think that, someone with your connection points and your interfaces with other people professionally, you would have, it's easy to think that healthcare related persons, even with your advanced degrees, you went to some obscure school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, from what I recall, and so, and then graduate degree, Washington University, from what I remember.
Correct.
And so you're talking about the absolute highest end of our countries as far as academic background and professional background. Still a maze, a difficult situation, no question.
Absolutely, and yet I'm in a really, really good place now. I'm really quite pleased.
So we'll have to deal with your wife. She'll have to endure then, kind of the individual health insurance market. This is something that, many people face. But your overall economics, your overall math of money should be improved. That was our intended outcome, if you will. And then we'll go on until November or whenever I think Q4 of 2020. Is that right? From what I remember.
Yes, that in October of 2020 is when she converts, and we're only, fortunately, with what you were able to develop, Jay. We're only spending as much on her as I spent for her COBRA coverage before. So, it's a lot of money, but I'm anxiously looking forward to that period before her birthday when we can start to sign her up for Medicare and get everything in place so that the transition occurs without a hiccup.
So your math of money at the Goldmann household then, basically is $650 a month saved premium, and then when you require healthcare coverage, entirely different coverage, meaning that your coverage under Medicare vastly superior than COBRA. And this is nothing against your employer, right? I mean,
no, not at all.
Right.
They're doing what they can. Medicare is structured in such a way that, especially if you buy supplemental coverage and coverage in Part D to pay for your meds, that, while you're spending money up front, there's a lot less out of pocket. It's a really good system, which I knew when I was working before. It was the making sure I qualified appropriately that was the challenge.
So you did realize that you were looking forward to Medicare. This is a new fact that we've never discussed. This did you? Some people think that Medicare is weaker. Some people believe that Medicare is weaker.
Medicare, having been in this field for a long time, providers like doctors and hospitals aren't thrilled with Medicare, largely because it doesn't pay as much as commercial insurance. However, from the consumer standpoint, it's wonderful coverage. I couldn't recommend it more highly.
And you've touched on a great point because a lot of the talk on the news, et cetera, or commercials and policy talk has to do with complaints about certain policies, et cetera, and taxation, and all the fragments we have in our nation that you and I are not going to solve. That's for sure. But it doesn't. They don't really address the consumer's point of view, who are enormously satisfied, overwhelmingly satisfied, much like you.
No, it really doesn't. I don't want to get on my soapbox here, and I'm certainly not going to get political. I'm not going to get political. But when you recognize that in the United States we have the highest infant mortality rate of all of the developed countries in the world, we've got problems that we have to fix. That's just unconscionable.
We have fundamental problems. And like you said, it's an interesting thing because a lot of times I get pulled into the conversation about this structure or that structure. We're about to have a national election in a year's time. Nevertheless, I tell people that to the consumer ultimately is noise. I mean, it affects their vote, how they will vote, maybe, but it doesn't affect how consumers will choose and think through the Medicare enrollment process or what coverage is best for them, based on their financial situation, their health situation. Because that side, just as you see, $100 a month for Medigap, that has to be the result of intense competition, right? I mean, there's no other way.
Absolutely. I think competition has its place in our healthcare financing system, and I think, but it can be done in a way that certainly is better for consumers than it's currently done now.
And do you see that even though that's not your configuration? I mean, you have Medigap, and I try to tell people, if you just think about it as fruits or vegetables, it is entirely different in structure. And then there's Medicare Advantage, which are these combined packages, largely combining health and prescription, 35% of the market plus, and CEOs of the carriers going to 50% over time, at $0 in many locations, even in PPO form. So one size we can fit, the correct configuration based on person's resources and needs. So, and competition again. I mean, even though you didn't experience it, Jim, other households in the neighboring county or in other streets, around you, certainly available.
Well, and in fact, I've been thinking that, once my wife qualifies for Medicare and I'm not on the road like I am now, I will certainly want to chat with you about whether it makes sense to transition to Medicare Advantage, because I think there are a lot of, I hate to use the word again, but advantages of it, and I want to be able to weigh the pros and cons and figure out what's best in our particular situation.
That's an excellent point, and I don't want to, we're going to swerve back to the more interesting of your books in just a couple of moments, but what you see is that in 10 years' time, your premium is no longer 100, but even in different locations, what you have is it continues to increase, so much so that all the premiums times 12 is greater than the out-of-pocket maximum on Medicare Advantage PPOs. That does happen. That you can see that today. So, I tell persons this is the point of my book on maximize your Medicare, which is, hey, this is a financial planning matter. Yes, you want to see the doctors and healthcare matters. The book's not really about that. It's really about how does somebody get the most for their money, given what they require, given their financial resources. And you can see that doesn't stay static, right? Today, Jim Goldman pays $100 for Medigap. Jim Goldman at 87, will pay substantially more. And like you said, you're not going to be on the road as much anymore, or everyone's going to come to you because you're, healthcare consultant emeritus. The usefulness, the superiority of Medigap, those features, start to erode. So you can easily see it.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that this has been very interesting, Jim, and just because, like I said, most of the time that I speak in public, I'm talking to myself and there are questions, etc., or I get interviewed on the radio, but it's very instructive. It's very informative for people to hear from your seat, because I'm sensitive to the fact that everybody has a different set of circumstances. Kind of hard to find one size fits all, don't you think? Or
absolutely, it's and that's not bad. I mean, we all have needs that are particular to our individual situations, and from a financial planning perspective, as you stated, and as an individual health perspective, it's important to structure your coverage in a way that works for you and for your family.
So you spent 4 decades crossing the country and interfacing with all different types of healthcare providers and different companies, hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. Do I have that right? I mean,
hospitals, physicians, payers, hospital software companies. If it's in this field, you name it. And it's, from high-end hospitals, exemplary teaching institutions, to rural hospitals and those serving those most in need. I've been very fortunate to be able to work in this area.
My real question is, where in the world did you find time to write not one, but three fictional books, which are available on Amazon.com? The first one, and I've read the first and 3/4 of the second. So the first one, called Connections by Jim Goldmann. You can see it on Amazon.com. It's only $4, and it's also available there on paperback. But anyway, where in the world did you find the time, and how did you come up with the idea of Connections?
Well, in terms of coming up with the idea, I have a good friend and colleague when I worked up in Ohio, who had written a book and challenged me also to write something. And we had that kind of relationship where, I really did take that as a serious challenge. As I was considering what kind of story I might want to tell, I was struck by something that I had learned when I was working with IBM. We had taken a client to our research center in Austin, Texas. There I learned that we developed a computer processor with the same number of connections as the brain of a reptile, like a snake or a lizard. Interestingly, that processor provided enough heat to boil a cup of coffee.
Wow.
They projected that a processor with as many connections as the human brain would produce as much heat as a small nuclear reactor.
So,
and go ahead.
So you lost a bet at a drinking game, and you were forced to write a novel. Is that basically what I'm hearing?
There was minimal alcohol involved.
Okay.
But I took that concept and I said, what would happen if we increased the connections in a normal person's brain? What would the effects be? And so there's, quite frankly, not only a lot of projection, but a lot of research in current science that went into this writing.
So you had this concept, and you'd seen, the idea, and it's so fascinating because the number of different topics this crosses. So the main character of the person, and I don't want to, downgrade or basically, not pay the proper justice. So why don't we just talk about Connections just for a moment? We've got some main characters here, highly qualified persons, and with the interesting last name of Newman. Is that right?
That is correct, and that was chosen for a very, very definite purpose. And
That's
it has two N's on the end, just like Goldmann does.
Well, when I was reading it, and then it didn't strike me, of course, and and then I'm thinking to hey, this is like Death of a Salesman, Willie Loman, or the movie the Truman Show, right? I mean, now we've got Newman, of course, and they have these experiments because he was, and without giving away too much of the book, he is the victim of an accident which had left him in a debilitating state. Is that right, if I recall correctly?
Michael was in a car accident and suffered serious brain injury in the car accident, and in fact was slowly dying.
And his wife?
But his wife happens to be a research scientist and neurologist. And she is desperately, she's actually working for a large biotech company, doing some work with them, but on the side, she's really desperately trying to find a cure for her husband, find a way to bring his function back.
So they find a cure, and without, again, giving the book, because, you definitely should read this first one, especially because it's a great setup to, the rest. So they find a cure, and then there are, what would we call it? Unintended ripple effects or unanticipated ripple effects?
Absolutely. It goes so far as to suggest that these ripple effects will ripple throughout all of society. That in fact they make discoveries that are truly A, groundbreaking, but B, rooted deeply in our history and our culture. And I'll leave it at that. And
No,
by the way, it's a thriller as well.
I mean, it's very fascinating because you can see that, or it's kind of almost like we have a catalyst, some kind of jump start to what we might think takes, generations just on evolution, for example, and all of a sudden you almost have something like, let's skip a step or let's fast forward the step, and then we have these other, as you appropriately named, connections. So very interesting stuff. And then you've got the entire, obviously, business aspect, because you have biotech companies, and then, as many people know, the industrial military complex, of course, the obvious applications, become involved. I mean, I don't think that it's a secret that a lot of our technological advances have, had military, beginnings, if you will.
Absolutely. And in fact, there's not only that biological component to this, but there's also a computer component to this.
Oh, right, exactly.
Where the two get paired together in an absolutely fascinating way, and I'll just leave it at that.
No, I know. It's very interesting topic, very stimulating topic, because this specific topic is kind of like this intersection of, and the way that you've written it is this intersection of not only a personal story, but then one that has many connections, if you will, with all different parts of our society and the way that we think about stuff. It's very fascinating. It's very interesting. So now we've got 3 books. Go ahead, please.
I'm just glad you're enjoying it.
So now we got 3 books, and connections, confrontation, and convergence. And what's the plan for Jim Goldmann? Are you going to keep writing books along these lines, or what do you plan to do?
I ended the 3rd book, I think, in a very good place. And I was starting to think about, well, what would I write about next? And I had an idea for this, and I had an idea for that. And one of my readers came up to me and said, I really miss your characters. And I thought, you know what? I miss them too. And so I've been working on Mind Out of Time for about 6 months now. That's the working title.
Okay.
And I'm starting to think that the first 3 books may just have been prologue, somewhat the way that The Hobbit was prologue to the Lord of the Rings series. I'm really very excited to see where this goes.
And that's interesting that you said that, because as I was reading this book, I'm like, as a serial, and much like in today, we've got these things made into movies. And in a way, like you said, kind of it has a thriller element to it. It has a scientific element to it. It's topical to things that we talk about today, as far as, what advances technology and computers and how they affect all of our lives and things like that. And we've got this series of books here that kind of touch on a lot of them. Seriously, I was thinking, boy, Tom Hanks is calling, to try to make this into a movie. Although, someone else may have said that, they've got a different serial that he would work on, but that kind of thing, because they do touch on all these different interesting topics.
I think it would adapt itself to film well, in part because the characters are very real people dealing with very real situations. And, people like to go to movies, I think, where they, where they're on the edge of their seat and they're excited, but they want to be able to identify with the characters and that they're not two-dimensional. They're people struggling with the same things that they're struggling with day in and day out. I'm trying to find an angle to get into Hollywood right now. A friend of mine who just retired from that world suggested I find an actor or actress who would be good in one of these roles and pitch it to them. So if you have any suggestions, I'd love to hear it.
So brutal. I can, as a person that has written a self-published book as myself, the industry, the entire business side of that, so difficult and complicated. The number of different interfaces is so complicated, almost impossible to weave through. But absolutely, I mean, I would have thought that, this idea and this topic and the way that you've, like you said, right, written about the characters, especially because in this day and age, what you've got is, like I said, without giving away too much of the book, the wife is not only strictly qualified to do the scientific research, but in addition to that is a caregiver, for her husband, right? A strictly
Right.
and if we circle back to Medicare, if you will, that a lot of times a lot of the burden, the challenge, is not only physical but emotional, just the weight of the topic itself and taking care of someone who cannot take care of themselves, has so many different facets and, can be difficult. And, I think your books, especially this first one, kind of, touches on, the fact that even that she knows scientific facts, and yet there's a whole other emotional aspect.
Well, and in fact, they find themselves as two ships passing in the night. Michael has, the world he's living with.
Right.
Gabby has the world she's living with, and they're growing further and further apart because those worlds are so different. And they're not only struggling to deal with their circumstances, but they struggle with each other as well.
Well, absolutely. And so back to how you can find the book. You can find it on Amazon. Is that right, Jim?
Well, Amazon, all three books are available both electronically and in paper on Amazon and on Barnes & Noble.
Oh, awesome. So Amazon.com. So what's the fastest way to see it? By the title, Connections? Is that right? Or
yeah, I would go into a search engine. I usually use something like Google, and you can type in Jim Goldmann with two N's on Goldman and Connections, and it'll bring it up. Or you can put in Jim Goldmann author, and it'll bring all three up.
Absolutely. So be sure to go to, especially in this day and age, please buy the book, read the book, leave them a good review there. So important in this day and age that people are. That's the ship we're on, and we're not going back ashore. I don't think that there's any doubt about that.
But based on feedback I've had so far, I don't think you'll be disappointed.
Jim Goldmann, Connections. Thank you so much, Jim. I've enjoyed today.
I have as well. Thanks so much, Jay.